Good afternoon. I'm Mr. Craven from the NET English Director Team, and today I'm going to be talking through Shelley's poem Ozymandias. Now, Percy Shelley was born in 1792 and died in 1822, and he was one of the most famous of what became known as the Romantic poets. The Romantics were a group of poets in the 18th and 19th centuries who were very interested in nature. They were finding much of their inspiration in the natural world. Now, the Romantics were quite a varied group, but general trends were that they believed passionately in social justice and the rights of women in the working class, and they tended to value emotional experience far more than rationality. Shelley was an atheist, and he was particularly radical in both his poetry and in his views on society. Shelley's father was a knight, and he attended some of the best schools in the country before he went to university. Unfortunately, Shelley was kicked out of university before finishing his degree, due to his political and his religious views. Now, Shelley married relatively young, although the marriage didn't last, and Shelley spent a lot of his adult life embroiled in romantic and social scandals, something he shared with his close friend Lord Byron, although Shelley eventually became quite dedicated to his second wife, Mary, who was the author of Frankenstein. The couple spent a lot of their marriage travelling around Europe together. Now, Shelley actually drowned aged 29 when his boat capsized. Despite dying quite young, Shelley went on to be quite a key influence on a wide range of later poets. Now, the Romantic poets in general tended to move away from British society's obsession with Greek and they looked instead to cultures like the Egyptians for ideas and influences. And Ozymandias as a poem is partly the result of this. Shelley was inspired to write the poem in 1817 after the British Library acquired the head and torso of a statue of Ramesses II, which was from Egypt, and dated back to about the 13th BCE. Now, Ozymandias was the Greek name for Ramesses II. In terms of who Ramesses II was, he was probably the pharaoh who is described in Exodus in the Bible. He reigned from about 1279 BC to about 1212, and he was known as Ramesses after his death when he was about 90. He was also known as Ramesses the Great Ancestor. He was probably the most powerful and successful of Egypt's pharaohs, with a string of military successes which expanded the Egyptian empire at the time, and he also put into place large-scale building works across Egypt. That a Greek historian had described a huge Egyptian statue of the kind that the library had acquired, and he also heard about its inscription, which the historian had recorded, which went along the lines of, "King of kings, Ozymandias am I. If any want to know how great I am and where I lie, let him outdo me in my work." Now, the mismatch between the vainglorious hubris of the statement and the reality of these fragments of the statue, Shelley and one of his friends challenged each other to write competing sonnets about the same topic. Now, Shelley's poem was published in 1818, and in keeping with the statue and the inscription, it explores the impact of time, the sense of the inevitability of history. And it was presenting the idea that all things, no matter how powerful or how important, ultimately fade into nothing. Nothing's permanent, not kings, not empires, and everything that we are and everything that we do ultimately fades into oblivion and anonymity. And it's exactly why the poem was quoted so widely in training that final season of Breaking Bad, why one of the final episodes was called Ozymandias, and that's also why the character in Watchmen was named after him. Now, the poem is a sonnet. It's not a particularly unusual type of sonnet, although it is perhaps a little dated, a little time that Shelley was writing. There are a few possible reasons for that choice of form. So for one thing, Shelley is writing a poem about an ancient statue and an ancient king, so using a rather old-fashioned poetic form and style seemed quite a neat fit. For another, the sonnet form is, after all, probably the most famous kind of English. It was popularised during Shakespeare's lifetime, and it was linked particularly to his literary legacy. In fact, the sonnet originally came from Italy, and was more or less invented by a different poet called Petrarch, although appropriately enough, people do forget that. Even the kind of sonnet that Shakespeare most commonly used was actually created by someone else, and yet we forget, and we call it a Shakespearean sonnet. Now, in fitting with that old-fashioned verse form, which has that kind of proud history, Shelley has also used more or less perfect iambic pentameter for the lines, and that's these 10-syllable lines, with this unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable as a regular rhythmic pattern. And that isn't unusual, but it is certainly associated with literary heritage and the past. The rhyme scheme, despite making the poem a sonnet, is a little unusual, and it's A, B, A, B, C, D, C, E, D, E, F, E, F. Now, usually a sonnet divides fairly neatly into an 8-line section, which is called an octet, and a 6-line section, which is called a sestet. This one doesn't perfectly. In fact, it's hard to divide it up at all, really. The rhyme scheme is also complicated by some striking half rhymes. Now, stone and frown don't fully rhyme, and the same is true of appear and despair. Half rhymes help to smooth out the rhyme scheme somewhat. They prevent it becoming too obvious, too obtrusive, and they better fit that reflective, melancholic tone of the poem. Now, the poem opens with the idea of this traveller from an antique land. Shelley is presented as a semi-mythical traveller's story, an exotic tale of a far-off land. The distancing effect of this perspective, it is important. We are removed from the reality of Ozymandias by geography, by time, by perspective. We're limited to this word-of-mouth report. The traveller and the land being antique, both linked to the passage of time. However mighty this King of Kings may have been, time moves on, and we are all limited by space. King of Kings. Now, while it does have other reference frames, it's also a title used to refer to Jesus within Christianity. For example, the first epistle to Timothy and the book of Revelations. Now, in terms of Shelley's devoted atheism, could we see here the poet actually predicting the decline and fall of the European Christian dominance in the world at this point? Maybe of organised religion as a whole? Possibly. The statue from which Shelley drew his inspiration had existed around 13 centuries before Jesus of Nazareth had even been born. And yet this ancient power had crumbled to nothing. Empires, both temporal and spiritual, decline and die, the poem seems to be suggesting. Now, the remnants of the statue, considering, the legs may be vast, but there's no body attached to them, no trunk, no real substance. It's particularly ironic in terms of them being built of stone, something we think of as lasting, juxtaposed with the desert and the sand, which shift endlessly and erode whatever's there. The idea that the legs starting, time moves on, the traveller travels, but the legs stay the same, the past is unchanging. The visage being shattered represents the facelessness of this figure. Now, this was someone powerful, someone used to being obeyed, and we can tell that from their frown and their sneer. However, now their face isn't even complete. It's linked also to the idea of the statue itself being only a representation of the figure. In an odd sort of way, the statue for the traveller is almost a parallel for the traveller to the narrator. The real king is represented by the statue for the traveller, the statue is a traveller for the narrator. We've got no contact with the real figure, only this vague record of their representation. Notice how the lines from near them to cold command, while they are still an iambic pentameter, they're divided by these caesuras, these breaks in the lines, after them, lies and lip. It's as if the fragmented lines and these lists of features are being used to reflect these few remaining fragments of the past that are left behind. Now, the passions read by its sculptor still survive, stamped on these lifeless things, with that juxtaposition of the passions and these fragments being quite telling, I think. Ultimately, there is no life left now, however vital, however living the figure may have been when alive. And Shelley perhaps is making the point here that life and living are far more important and meaningful than things which are cold and static and dead. The statue perhaps better represents the artist, the sculptor's skill, rather than the actual figure. And just as Shelley's poem is in many ways a better known and more permanent, more lasting record of the statue than these stone fragments themselves. It's appropriate that the words should appear on this pedestal. A pedestal, not simply with somewhere to stand statues, but with fixing something to be admired, kind of elevating something to the level of significance and meaning. So there's an irony then to the words. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. To the originator, the intention is to boast about his absolute power and his significance in the world. The idea that we couldn't possibly compete with him. Now, we essentially interpret that as an audience, the significance of this imperative given as being the exact opposite. Even this all-powerful figure, this King of Kings, has come to nothing. It's been forgotten. It's left behind as these sporadic fragments rather than as a permanent record. As mentioned earlier, both King of Kings and the idea of a person's works are resonant with this biblical Christianity. In Matthew, for example, readers are warned against false prophets. From their works you shall know them. For Shelley, anyone mighty looking at this statue should compare and should despair, because ultimately everyone will end up like the statue, broken, abandoned, forgotten. As Shelley points out, nothing beside remains. Full stop, reinforcing this brutal truth. What is left round the decay of that colossal wreck is simply the lone and level sands which are stretching far away. A world that moves on without caring about the loss of this past, with those alliterated plosives on boundless and bare, juxtaposed now very firmly bounded, limited. Nature and the natural world are unlimited, which is, I think, is what Shelley is seeming to suggest, whereas humankind can't help but be limited by, again, time and space. Now, again, it's worth considering Shelley's atheism here. Now, for those who belong, a key concept of most of them is that idea of heaven, a comfort for the future, meaning after death, permanency, unlike the simple and empty ending that Shelley seems to envisage here, where the body crumbles into dust, we are buried within the earth, and all that's left is nothingness, boundless and bare, sand or stone of the statue. It's also briefly worth thinking about the time that Shelley was writing. Now, after the defeat of France in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had established itself as the dominant power on land and sea, certainly in Europe and arguably in the world as a whole. In fact, for a lot of the 19th century, it was a kind of global policeman, supervising what became known as the Pax Britannica, the British peace. In addition, during the 19th century, Britain was transformed by the Industrial Revolution, gained control of India, of large parts of Africa, including Egypt eventually, and the economies of much of Asia and South America also through its turns. Now, Britain governed, without question, the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it was supremely confident in its foreign relations, pursuing this course of splendid isolation, secure in its military and economic dominance across the world. Now, whether or not that's what Shelley had in mind when he wrote, it's hard to determine. However, it seems a remarkable coincidence that Shelley should write a poem about this hubris, this arrogance that seems to challenge the gods, just when Britain had become so dominant, so self-assured, and so apparently secure in terms of its empire. From a modern perspective, compare this to the kind of arrogance that embroiled Britain in much of the conflict that took place across Europe in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, up to the mid-20th century, and to also consider the British Empire as it is now, which is this loose confederation of Commonwealth countries, some lasting political problems, and these few tiny islands dotted around nations around the globe, and that lasting sense of frustrated self-importance. There was an interesting footnote. The statue of Ramesses II that inspired the poem, it was finally reassembled and restored in 1955, and it still stands in Egypt. Now, the finished statue was about 11 metres tall, 3-metre high pedestal. However, it did have to be moved after the realisation that traffic pollution was causing the stonework to erode. And there is, I think, an irony in there somewhere. Okay, now thank you very much for listening. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask your English teachers, who would be more than happy to help.